presidential candidacy.
I think so too.
With Elizabeth Warren as the candidate. That's what I think she's going to find.
The thing I did not spend a lot of time talking with her about, because I didn't want to waste too much time like in process weedy stuff, but you and I know this stuff is important, is that she has already put together such a formidable apparatus in terms of early state campaign staffers and in terms of the organization that she's got around her. And I mean, yes, this is exploratory, but you can tell from the work that she's already done and the people she's already hired and the work she's already put out there for this exploration that this is going to be a big full-time, marquee level campaign.
Yeah, she really has an A team, and she attracted an A team, and she knew how to assemble an A team, and that takes a while. And I know there are a lot of people out there who like to pretend that presidential campaigns start sometime around now. They start a long time before now. And if you have read the history of a single presidential campaign, you know that they basically start within a week of the last presidential election, somewhere in that first week after Hillary Clinton shocked the Democratic Party by coming in second in the Electoral College. There were a bunch of Democrats, including Elizabeth Warren, who had to be in conversations with themselves, at least, about running for president.
Yeah, and then there's the interesting question of who else are the other key people you talk to early on to try to set up the initial building blocks for you running a serious marquee level campaign. And one of the things that Elizabeth Warren just told me is that she thinks that all of the Democratic candidates should say, we're not going to take money from billionaire super PACs. In which case, if that happens, that would actually change those initial calls, right? Because even the most progressive candidates end up calling the big donors, the big bundlers, the people who can shift large amounts of fundraising resources their way. If those aren't the initial calls, if the initial calls are to staffers and to people who sort of are power brokers in different ways other than just with large amounts of money, that does change sort of the gatekeeper level conversations for who gets to come in at a top tier level.
Yeah, there has not been a Democratic nominee for president who wants to do it the way Elizabeth Warren announced. She thinks they should all do it on your program. We're going to talk about that later in this hour. Great interview, Rachel, and thank you for supplying us with material that we're going to use later in the hour.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Thanks, Rachel. Well, in his first public speaking of the new year today, the President of the United States revealed that the 27 psychiatrists and mental health professionals who co-authored the book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, are right. That Donald Trump's condition is obviously getting worse. Now, all of us in middle age and above find ourselves spending more and more time looking for our keys. There's some neurological decline is absolutely inevitable over time. Can't escape it. But Donald Trump's is dramatic. If you thought that his pathological lying could not become more pathological or that he could not become more delusional, you were wrong, and the mental health professionals who told us he would are right. Here is a sample of President Trump's 2019 mental process.
When they say I'm not popular in Europe, I shouldn't be popular in Europe. I don't care about Europe. I'm not elected by Europeans.
You got that? He's not elected by Europeans, so he's now self-aware enough to realize that he's not popular in Europe. Or is he? Because then he said this.
I could be the most popular person in Europe. I could run for any office if I wanted to, but I don't want to.
And there you have the first president of the United States who felt it necessary to say, I don't want to run for office in Europe. But of course, also said that he could, if he wanted to. Those statements came when the president was talking to reporters in the cabinet room with a new acting Secretary of Defense sitting right beside him. And the new acting Secretary of Defense, Patrick Shanahan, had to sit there and listen to the pathological liar beside him say that the reason we now have an acting Secretary of Defense is that Donald Trump fired Defense Secretary James Mattis, something the world knows is a lie. In fact, General Mattis shocked Donald Trump with a public resignation letter that took Donald Trump several days to figure out was actually an attack on him. Donald Trump's first encounter with the American military involved what most men his age in 1968 were trying to do, and that is avoid military service in combat in the Vietnam War. Last week, the day after Christmas, the New York Times revealed that the foot doctor who provided Donald Trump with the written excuse of bone spurs to get out of military service told his daughter that he did that as a favor for Donald Trump's father, who was then the doctor's landlord. Now that Donald Trump has spent some time around generals, including his former defense secretary, retired Marine General James Mattis, who he now condemns as incompetent, Donald Trump thinks that he could have gone all the way to the top in the American military. And today, he actually said this.
I think I would have been a good general, but who knows?
Who knows? I know. We all know. Everyone in that room today with the president knows. The world knows that Donald Trump would not have been a good general and could probably have never made it through basic training. Trump supporters know that. Even they know that. And so the president's delusion is getting worse, much worse. Or at least his willingness to publicly display his delusion is getting even worse now as he ages and as we enter a new year. The congressional leadership, including Democrats and Republicans, who went to the White House today to discuss a solution to the partial shutdown of the government that Donald Trump forced when he flip-flopped and violated his own agreement to sign a bill that was passed unanimously by the United States Senate. Before that, delegation of Democrats and Republicans, including Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, went to the White House today. A New York Times profile of former Democratic leader of the Senate, Harry Reid, quoted Senator Reid saying this about Donald Trump, quote, "You can't legislate when you have a chief executive who's weird, for lack of a better description." Harry Reid is right, of course. And so after that weird meeting with the weird chief executive that was weirdly held for no reason at all in the Situation Room, everyone agreed to only one thing, and that was that nothing was accomplished by that meeting. But tonight there is yet another comment for the psychiatrists studying Donald Trump to consider, a comment that has leaked from that meeting. NBC News is reporting that Senator Chuck Schumer repeatedly asked the president why he would not support passing 6 spending bills that both parties have already agreed to that would reopen government departments and agencies that have no jurisdiction over the border wall that Donald Trump wants to fund. Donald Trump eventually answered saying, "I would look foolish if I did that." Now consider the enormity of the delusion in that statement. First of all, Donald Trump thinks that if he did something rational, like sign spending bills for everything that the Democrats and Republicans already agree on, he would look foolish. But it also means that he does not think that he already looks foolish. He looks foolish to most Americans. He has looked foolish to most Americans every day of his political career, which is why he didn't win as many votes as Hillary Clinton. And if we were to analyze this comment about looking foolish just within the framework of the government shutdown, just within the couple of weeks framework of that, it would mean that Donald Trump does not believe that he looked foolish when he said this 3 weeks ago.
You know what I'll say? Yes. If we don't get what we want, one way or the other, whether it's through you, through a military, through anything you want to call, I will shut down the government.
Okay,
absolutely.
fair enough.
And I am proud, and I'll tell you what,
disagree.
I am proud to shut down the government for border security, Chuck. I will take the mantle. I will be the one to shut it down. I'm not going to blame you for it.
Joining our discussion now, Jennifer Palmieri, former White House communications director for President Obama, former communications director for Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. Also with us, Adam Gentleson, former deputy chief of staff to Senator Harry Reid. He's currently the director of public affairs for Democracy Forward, and Francesca Chambers, the White House correspondent for the Daily Mail. And Jennifer Palmieri, you've worked in a White House. We have never seen anything like what we're seeing in this White House, and that decision today to have a legislative meeting about the budget in the Situation Room was obviously a stunt at the Republican White House. And it makes me wonder, at what point do the Democrats say, we aren't going to participate in White House stunts? If you want to have real White House meetings, we'll attend those.
Right. I mean, I think that in the first meeting of the year, when you're the incoming speaker and the Senate Minority Leader, in the case of Pelosi and Schumer, and the President of the United States asks for you to come to meeting in the White House, you need to go. I thought that it was in the Situation Room, probably for an obvious reason being to make it seem as if national security is at stake with the wall, which of course it's not. The other could be very clever staff work, which is even at a Trump White House, you're not going to let the press send their cameras into the Situation Room. And perhaps a staff person wisely thought the White House end that not allowing cameras in is it was going to end up being better for the president, and Situation Room is a place to do that.
Oh, I think that's a great point, Jennifer. I didn't think of that the White House staffers not wanting a rerun of that Schumer-Pelosi confrontation with Donald Trump on video picked a room where there could be no video. But Adam Jellison, earlier in the day in the cabinet room, we saw the president in new flights of delusion and pathological lying about everything from his imagined firing of James Mattis to he could have been a great general himself.
Yeah, what feels scary about this shutdown, which has massive effects across the country, not just for people who work for the government, but people who rely on the government for many different types of services, is that, when we went through the previous longest shutdown in 2013, we were going through it, but you at least had the feeling that the players involved were responding to rational inputs. If Republicans had a really bad day of press stories, we on the Democratic side knew that would weaken their resolve and make them more likely to compromise. What's really scary about this shutdown is it doesn't feel like Trump is responding to rational inputs. And it makes you wonder how long this could actually go on.
Yeah, and Francesca, that goes to the Harry Reid comment of you can't negotiate with someone who is this weird. And Harry Reid had a lot more to say than that in this New York Times profile. I'm just going to read some of it here. Harry Reid said about Trump, he is not immoral, but is amoral. Amoral is when you shoot someone in the head, it doesn't make a difference, no conscience. Harry Reid then went on to say, I think he is, without question, the worst president we've ever had. And Francesca, that comes out today, and it's not really a controversial report, and there isn't really any kind of counter-argument being pushed anywhere by Republicans that Donald Trump is not the worst president we've ever had.
Well, Republicans were a little bit busy today with Mitt Romney's comments. Lots of big news today, including the government shutdown and responding to Jen's comments. I do think there's something to the fact of having it in an area where reporters absolutely couldn't be allowed in, and the president couldn't say at the last minute, you know what, let's bring them on in here, because that happens quite often at the White House, where it's something that's supposed to be, quote unquote, closed press, and then the president decides to bring reporters in at the last minute. The original meeting with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi wasn't supposed to have reporters in it either, and then we all saw how that turned out. So by having it in the Situation Room, they could say that they're getting a very important border security, national security update, but it also kept reporters out of the room. And
Adam, I want to get your reaction of your former boss Harry Reid about what he had to say about the president today.
Well, I thought it was classic Senator Reid. He's always had a way with words. It was a way with words that kept those of us on his press staff on our toes frequently. But the thing about it was he said what he meant, and he meant what he said, and you never had to guess where he was coming from. And I think that came through in this interview. I think he made himself very clear about how he feels about President Trump. And I think most Americans would agree with him.
We're going to go back into the cabinet room to take one more look at what the president had to say there today. And this is where he found himself basically publicly negotiating with himself a little bit over how much money he'd be able to settle for involving his wall if he could get any out of the Democrats in Congress. Let's listen to this, where he doesn't rule out accepting less than the $5 billion he's allegedly demanding. Let's listen to this.
Is there a number below $5 billion that you might be willing to accept in order to reopen the government and get this thing moving forward?
Well, I'd rather not say it. Could we do it for a little bit less? It's so insignificant compared to what we're talking about.
All right, now let's just compare that TV negotiating style with Nancy Pelosi's TV negotiating style with Savannah Guthrie. Let's watch this.
Are you willing to come up and give him some of this money for the wall? Because apparently that's the sticking point.
No, nothing for the wall. We're talking about border security.
Nothing for the wall, but that means it's
well,
a
we can go
non-starter.
through this all, back and forth. No. How many more times can we say no? Nothing for the wall.
Jennifer, very different style between those two.
Yeah, she's probably the most effective negotiator and legislator that we've seen in Congress in a generation. And I think that, she's in a difficult position. She's the Speaker of the House. She's trying to negotiate with a president that's not particularly competent and a bad negotiator and untrustworthy. So I think, that she has to have a position that you can stick with. And I think she's come up with it. She and Schumer both come up with a very reasonable one. Let's pass what we can pass now. Hold Homeland Security back, that one appropriations bill back for a few weeks, and come to agreement on that. But let's proceed with funding what we can. I think sometimes you try to game out. Behind both sort of signaling to the press where you're going, but also working behind the scenes to lay out where you want a negotiation to actually end up. But you can't really do that with this president because he's not someone you can negotiate with, and he's not trustworthy. So I think you have to stick with a most responsible governing position that you can, which she has come up with, understanding that this House just got elected with a lot of people not supporting President Trump and not supporting the wall, and hope that you can bring the Senate along with you and give the president something that he's forced to sign.
Francesca, are there any signals at all in the White House about where they might be willing to go or where this is going to end up?
This is a little bit like the dog chasing its tail at this point, Lawrence, because we keep having the same conversation over and over again and going in circles on what it is that the president would want, what he would be willing to accept. And then today, GOP leaders came out of that Situation Room briefing saying that the president wants to see everyone back at the White House on Friday. And they said that that was because he seems to believe that there will be some movement on this issue after the leadership elections tomorrow. And it's not really clear what makes him believe that Nancy Pelosi would change her mind about this once she's elected speaker and be willing to give him the funding for the border wall, and why he seems to believe that there would be a solution to this on Friday. And I think you need to look to Mitch McConnell's comments today when he said that it could be days and even referred to weeks before there's a solution to this. So this shutdown could be lasting quite a bit longer.
Yeah, Mitch McConnell, who promised there would not be a shutdown even after the president threatened one, it seems to be just stepping out of this. Francesca Chambers, thank you for joining us. Jennifer Palmieri, Adam Jensen, thank you for starting us off. And when we come back, Donald Trump and Mitt Romney both proved today that Donald Trump fears Mitt Romney a lot more than Mitt Romney fears Donald Trump. And Jill Wine-Banks will join us with a new development in Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller's investigation. Donald Trump has a new problem, and his name is Mitt Romney. And judging by their exchanges today, Donald Trump fears Mitt Romney a lot more than Mitt Romney fears Donald Trump. Most senators become famous after they are elected to the United States Senate. It's the Senate that makes them famous, but some arrive in the Senate already famous, like younger brother of the President of the United States, Ted Kennedy, Harvard professor and former UN ambassador Daniel Patrick Moynihan, former New York Knicks basketball star Bill Bradley, and of course, former First Lady Hillary Clinton. The traditional advice for the big stars of the freshman class in the Senate is to stay quiet at the beginning. Try to convince your fellow senators that you're there to do the work of the Senate, not just there seeking more attention. Mitt Romney is the most famous freshman senator we've seen in a while. He is the first freshman senator in history who was the nominee of his party in a presidential campaign. Important footnote here. I know you're all thinking about Hubert Humphrey, who was also elected to the United States Senate after losing a presidential election as the Democratic nominee. But Hubert Humphrey had served 15 years in the Senate before becoming Lyndon Johnson's vice president and then the Democratic nominee for president in 1968. And so technically, Humphrey was not considered a freshman senator when he returned to the Senate. Mitt Romney ignored the tradition of famous freshman senators staying quiet, and he did it in a way that we have never seen before. He didn't even wait to be sworn in as a senator. He didn't wait for his first speech on the floor of the United States Senate. He wrote an op-ed piece in the Washington Post attacking Donald Trump's character, saying that Donald Trump does not have the essential qualities of honesty and integrity that Mitt Romney believes a president must have. And Donald Trump showed just how afraid of Mitt Romney he is in his response. There was no wild Twitter attack. The president, who does not know the meaning of the word team player, simply said that he hopes Mitt Romney will be a team player.
So with Mitt Romney, I'd love him to be a team player.
Mitt Romney attacked Donald Trump in even stronger language when Donald Trump was on his way to winning the Republican nomination for president. Then Mitt Romney did not vote for Donald Trump for president. He voted for the woman. Mitt Romney says he wrote in the name of the woman he is married to, Ann Romney, on the ballot for president of the United States. And now Mitt Romney attacks Donald Trump's character. And all Donald Trump has to say is, I hope he'll be a team player. That is what Donald Trump sounds like when he is afraid. Mitt Romney has just been elected to a 6-year term. Mitt Romney is going to be a senator longer than Donald Trump is going to be president. Mitt Romney owes Donald Trump nothing. And Mitt Romney owes Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell nothing. And one poll shows that 64% of Mitt Romney's extremely Republican state of Utah sent Mitt Romney to Washington to stand up to Donald Trump. And today, Mitt Romney said that he currently has no intention of running for president in Republican primaries against Donald Trump, but he's waiting to see who does.
I haven't decided who I'm going to endorse in 2020. I'm going to wait and see what the alternatives are.
Joining us now, David Frum, senior editor for The Atlantic, and Jonathan Capehart, Pulitzer Prize-winning opinion writer for The Washington Post and an MSNBC contributor. And Jonathan, I want you to put your Republican hat on. You worked for Republican Mayor of New York Mike Bloomberg when he was campaigning. So you've been inside what I would call the reasonable side of the Republican Party, where men like Mitt Romney have spent a lot of time. Certainly as a Massachusetts governor, that's where he was. Hard to tell much difference between Romney as a Massachusetts governor, Mike Bloomberg as a New York City mayor in policy terms. Your reaction to what you saw Romney do today and what you think it means for a senator like him who's now elected to a 6-year term and doesn't have to worry about being primaried next year in what is Donald Trump's party?
Well, I think you raise a very good point, Lawrence, when you say that Mitt Romney doesn't owe anything to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, doesn't owe anything to President Trump, which gives him a certain amount of freedom that a lot of the other Republican senators he's about to join don't have. The other thing is we will now find out, starting tomorrow, once he's sworn in, what he's going to do to marry these expressions of contempt for the president and for contempt for the president's moral character, both in the op-ed in the Washington Post and in a speech that he did a few months or so back, also lambasting the president. Whether he's going to marry that to actual action where he, as a sitting senator, will criticize the president, maybe vote against the president on something that the president wants. That is going to be the key thing, because the one thing we can't forget about Mitt Romney, he's no revolutionary. He's no bomb thrower. He's not someone who is going to go out there and, race to the ramparts. He's looking for order. He's looking for a way to go back to the way things used to be when we had a president who was a moral exemplar for the country. And I don't know if Mitt Romney is going to go so far as to be out there every day clubbing the president about the head over his moral failings.
Well, David, Mitt Romney said in his op-ed piece basically that he wasn't going to be out there every day clubbing the president. He was going to vote with the president when he agreed with the president. He was not going to vote with the president when he doesn't agree with the president, and he wasn't going to comment on every tweet. But we know in the Trump cycle of outrageous behavior, there is a point once every fortnight. It might not be once every tweet, but once every fortnight, there is something truly outrageous that the microphone will be put in front of Mitt Romney when he gets off that elevator elevator in the Senate office buildings, and he's going to have to say something.
Well, your question shows why this op-ed was so powerful and so astute. One of the problems that the more dissident Republican senators have had is they get whipsawed. That Jeff Flake will say this, and then he'll be barraged by questions. You said this, so why didn't you do the following 87 things? Mitt Romney has put down at the beginning his markers. I'm not going to pretend like Paul Ryan that I don't read the tweets. I'm telling you in advance, I'm not going to talk about them. I'm telling you in advance, I am reserving my commentary for signal moments, for the Charlottesville moments, when the president steps so far out of the bounds because otherwise I'm going to be constantly responding to every tweet every morning. Mitt Romney's also made it clear, don't ask me, am I going to oppose every nomination of the president's? I'm going to support most of them. I'm a Republican, and when he is in line with party teaching and party tradition, don't look to me to show my dislike for him by not voting like a Republican. So he's training expectations. And what he's doing is he's setting up a series of rendezvous with destiny in the near future, where when he does speak, and most of the time he won't, that speech will be ever more powerful precisely because it was so planned and so disciplined.
And Jonathan, one thing we don't know yet is what committee assignments is Mitt Romney going to have, because that's a very important forum for disagreement with a president. And we've seen it through the ages within the party. That's really the forum. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, for example, is the forum where the Democratic senatorial opposition to the Vietnam War began. Eugene McCarthy was a member of that committee. He ended up running against the Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson, who was waging the Vietnam War. And so those committee positions are the places where we often see the most important criticism of a president.
Right, you're right. And we're talking about a particular president who has a lot of acting secretaries and acting people in positions that are going to need Senate confirmation. And so depending on which committees Senator, soon-to-be Senator Romney sits on, we will get to see those moments where he is questioning the nominee, where he is putting them through their paces to see if they are qualified to be in the positions that they're in. That will be one test to see how Mitt Romney, Senator Romney, challenges President Trump. But then the next hurdle is going to be, how does he vote in the end on the floor? And my hunch is, and maybe David will disagree with me, but my hunch is that when push comes to shove, if the nominee is on paper is qualified to be in the position, I don't see someone like a Senator Romney who is all about order and respect for the institutions, denying a president, leave aside who the president is, but denying a president his nominee for a particular cabinet position.
I think you would see Senator Romney voting for a Justice Kavanaugh, but against a prospect of an Attorney General Whitaker. He is going to act like a Republican, and people who watch him, especially on the station, need to understand you cannot ask him to be different from who he is. But President Trump today put down a marker that is, I think, a real klaxon, especially for Republicans. At the end of in the middle of his cabinet session today, he delivered an endorsement of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. And not only did the thing that was so remarkable with that is not only did he endorse it, but he endorsed it in terms that only someone who is really listening very closely to the way today's Russia talks about then Soviet Union would know. In a way that very few people, someone who doesn't follow the news closely like President Trump, would do, and yet he picked up on the false Russian claim that the invasion then happened as a response to terrorism. I think you're going to see Romney at his most effective when he is speaking up for traditional Republican views, especially on foreign policy, against a president who's going to be under fire because of the questions, is this president's foreign policy view driven by compromise?
Go ahead, Jonathan, quickly.
Yeah, real quickly, on the loyalty piece, because you played that before, the president saying, I hope he's a team player.
Team player.
You know, he's hoping Romney is going to be loyal to him. But again, these nice words that he said about Romney, we know they're not going to last very long.
Jonathan Capehart and David Frum, thank you for joining us on our first episode of Senator Romney versus President Trump. There will be more. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks.
And when we come back, a new report says that Russians were pressuring Paul Manafort to pay some heavy financial debts that he owed them during the presidential campaign. Jill Wine-Banks will join us with analysis of that next. Tonight, an investigative report by Time magazine reveals that a former Russian spy pressured former Trump campaign chair Paul Manafort to pay his financial debts to a Russian oligarch with ties to Vladimir Putin. Viktor Boyarkin told Time magazine that he was in contact with Manafort during the 2016 presidential campaign on behalf of Oleg Deripaska. He owed us a lot of money, Boyarkin says, and he was offering ways to pay it back. In a series of emails sent that spring and summer, Manafort tried to offer private briefings about the presidential race to Deripaska, apparently, as one of the emails puts it, to, quote, get whole. Time magazine reports that Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller's team has approached Boyarkin regarding his connection to Manafort. Paul Manafort is scheduled to be sentenced on March 5th. Joining us now, Jill Wine-Banks, former Assistant Watergate Special Prosecutor and MSNBC legal analyst. And Jill, what is the Special Prosecutor looking for in this kind of situation? Is there anything illegal about offering a briefing to a Russian oligarch about the presidential campaign?
I think the major thing that is really standing out to me is what is the quid pro quo here, and why was he working for free for Donald Trump when he owed so much money that he couldn't repay it, and he was clearly being pressured? Did that influence how the platform got changed? The Republican platform suddenly became more pro-Russian. Did it affect sanctions? What do they have on Donald Trump as well as on Manafort? So I think that what Mueller has to be looking at is all of those things, not just Manafort.
And Jill, when the Special Prosecutor looks at emails, I mean, obviously this is an email traffic that Time magazine is aware of, so the Special Prosecutor has seen all of that email traffic, and this is one of the reasons why we all presumed Paul Manafort was cooperating with the Special Prosecutor, because he was in this deep, and the Special Prosecutor has all of his information. Now that cooperation has broken down, this seems like the looming sentencing for Paul Manafort includes all sorts of stuff that we don't know about.
Exactly. And, you know, we learned a lot when we found that Viktor Boyarkin was one of the people named in the sanctions list. Nobody really knew exactly who he was, but when you follow the chain of emails, that's who was mentioned as the go-between. And he's the one who was actually pressuring Manafort to pay back the money he owed. And obviously Manafort was trying to find a way to pay it back, whether it was through offering these private briefings, which might not be necessarily improper, but it certainly depends on what kind of information was released or what kind of promises were made. And we saw the change in the platform. That's a big clue. We saw the lack of interest in the sanctions that Congress wanted. Those are reasons to believe that something was being paid back.
And Jill, I don't have time to ask you about your pin tonight, but you always explain your pins on Twitter. So go to Jill's Twitter feed and you'll see an up-close shot of it, and she'll tell you all about it. Jill Wine-Banks, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. And when we come back, our political panel's reaction to Elizabeth Warren's first interview tonight as a presidential candidate with Rachel Maddow. Rachel's interview with Senator Elizabeth Warren in the last hour covered a lot of ground, including Senator Warren's long history working for consumer protection in the financial services industry. But it also revealed what might be one point of agreement that many Democratic presidential candidates have with Donald Trump about the American military withdrawal from Syria.
Now that the president made this decision the way he made it, do you agree with him?
So I think it is right to get our troops out of Syria. And let me add, I think it's right to get our troops out of Afghanistan. I think that everybody who keeps saying, no, 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 we can't do that in the defense establishment needs to explain what they think winning in those wars look like and where the metrics are. We're now 17 years in Afghanistan, and we control, what is it? That the government controls less than 60% of all the land. It doesn't have the support of the people. The heroin trafficking is up. There are multiple groups that are terrorist groups throughout Afghanistan, lots of different problems in Afghanistan, and what seems to be the answer from the foreign policy establishment, stay forever. That is not a policy. We can't do that. Now, having said that, when you withdraw, you got to withdraw as part of a plan. You got to know what you're trying to accomplish throughout the Middle East, and the pieces need to be coordinated, and they need to be coordinated not just in our activities, but this is why we need allies. This is why we build alliances.
Are you troubled by the nature of the president's process around
Are
the
you
Syria
asking
decision?
me whether or not I think foreign policy ought to be conducted by tweet? The answer is no, it should not. We actually need to plan this out and talk about with our allies how we ensure more safety and stability in the region. But the idea that the way we're going to do that is just to continue to keep troops and more troops forever and ever and ever in that part of the world, it is not working. And pretending that somehow in the future it is going to work by some unmeasured version of it, it's a form of fantasy that we simply can't afford to continue to engage in.
Jennifer Palmieri and Adam Jentelson will join us next with their reaction to Senator Warren's interview. Here is Senator Elizabeth Warren telling Rachel Maddow in the last hour why she is running for president. I mean, exploring the possibility of running for president.
This isn't about me. This is about tens of millions of families across this country who are getting cheated. And they're getting cheated on financial products. They're getting cheated on prescription drugs, a Washington that works great for drug companies, not for people who are trying to fill prescriptions. You can just keep going through the list. It's working great for oil companies that want to drill everywhere, not for families who have children that want to breathe the air. This is truly about what kind of a country we're going to be.
Back with us, Jennifer Palmieri and Adam Jentelson. Jennifer, I want to get your reaction to what I showed just before the break, which was this fundamental agreement with Donald Trump on Syria.
Right, and there'll probably be other Democrats in the presidential campaign that agree with her, and there'll be others. I think most notably it comes to mind Joe Biden, who will not. And what she. And the way she had laid it out was that either you leave with a thoughtful plan, or you stay forever. And I imagine that former Vice President Biden would argue that there is a different way, that you have a plan for what you're trying to achieve when you're in Syria, and you have a plan for what you're trying to achieve in Afghanistan. And I'm not sure, can't imagine that he would say the U.S. should just pull out of that part of the world, that that's a responsible thing, or ultimately in the United States' interest to do. I think the good news about having a lot of candidates in the Democratic field is these kind of issues can get a thorough examination, perhaps a more thoughtful one than we see happening from the discussion coming out of the White House.
Yeah, Adam, what's so striking about it is even though the positions are the same, they don't sound the same at all. When Donald Trump says something, it doesn't sound like anyone else's phrasing of the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's, what you heard from Senator Warren was a thoughtful approach to a similar outcome. And I think that's just something that's fundamentally different about her and President Trump. And probably, I think it's safe to say, most Democrats and President Trump. There's a very rational, thoughtful argument for why we should be pulling our troops out of Afghanistan and Syria. I think Senator Warren laid that out. But thoughtfulness is not something that is in great supply in the Trump White House.
And Jennifer, Senator Warren is going to have an important forum for this argument whenever there is a new Trump Defense Secretary nominee who comes up for confirmation. She's a member of the Armed Services Committee. She'll be able to engage that nominee in this directly in a very high-profile way.
Right. Yeah. If Trump has a nominee, and I could also see a scenario where he tries to avoid that and have the acting Secretary of Defense just stay there and not have that policy further examined. by the Congress. But I mean, we got a whole new ball game, right? We have a Democratic House that has a subpoena power. That means not. I think we all hear that phrase and we think about Mueller investigation in Russia, but that also means that the House Foreign Affairs Committee has oversight. And then you have the Democratic presidential campaign primary happening, where I think you're going to see a more thoughtful examination of issues, and that's going to really change the dynamic around Trump. And I think that you'll start to see that. We will see that new reality set in relatively quickly, and it should be sobering for the people at that address on Pennsylvania Avenue.
And Adam, Elizabeth Warren said she believes all the Democratic candidates should be directly financed from voters. She doesn't want self-funding by rich Democratic candidates, and she doesn't want giant corporate backers and other kind of PACs supporting Democratic candidates.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a bold position, and I think it's the right one. I think that one of the things that scares a lot of people about Senator Warren, scares people with power, is that she is proposing a fundamental shift in power. She wants to take power away from people who have used it to do some very bad things and give it to the people, and I think that's what she's proposing here.
Adam Jellison and Jennifer Palmieri, thank you both for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it. Tonight's Last Word is next, but first, over the Christmas and New Year's holidays, you continued to contribute to the Kind Fund at a record pace and have now contributed over $3 million in just the last month to provide desks to schools in Malawi and scholarships for girls to attend high school there. Your kindness this season has brought the total you have now contributed since we started the Kind Fund on this program 8 years ago to over $20 million. That extraordinary threshold was passed this season, and you are still contributing, as you can at any time at lastworddesks.msnbc.com. I'll have much more to say about this later, but tonight in our first show of the new year, I just want to say